I am Nyla, 28 years old, and somehow still healing from the wounds my family inflicted. As a successful fashion designer, I escaped their toxicity and built a life far away from their judgment. I will burn every last piece of this trash if it means saving our family reputation. My mother Vivica screamed those words 8 years ago as she threw my thrifted clothes into a backyard bonfire. She told me I was a permanent embarrassment to her high society lifestyle. Tonight, she sat in her multi-million-dollar living room surrounded by influential politicians and wealthy socialites watching the presidential inauguration ball. When the news anchor suddenly announced the name of the designer behind the First Lady custom gown, my mother violently spat her expensive red wine all over her pristine white rug. The entire room fell dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Washington, D.C. meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our mansion was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. I was the black sheep who refused to play their pretentious games, and they never let me forget it. But let us skip the childhood trauma and go straight to tonight. The night everything finally caught up to them. Let me take you directly into that opulent living room. It was the social event of the season. My mother had spent months orchestrating this watch party. She invited local senators, wealthy donors, and the most influential women in our community. She wanted everyone to see her custom, catering her imported floral arrangements and her desperate attempts to secure her place in the upper echelon of the elite society. My older sister Alicia was there too, posing for photos in a dress she bragged cost $15,000. Alicia was the golden child who played by all the rules of my mother, married a wealthy lobbyist, and never wore a single garment that lacked a recognizable luxury label. I was not invited. To them, I was still the weird girl who liked sewing scraps of fabric in the basement. They assumed I was living in a cramped apartment somewhere barely scraping by. They had no idea that for the past 6 years, I had been living in Paris, building a global fashion empire from the ground up. I kept my identity as the creative director of Maison Noire hidden from the press because I wanted my clothes to speak for themselves. And more importantly, I wanted to protect my peace from the toxic grasp of my mother. But the First Lady of the United States had personally requested my design for the inaugural ball. I could not say no, and I knew exactly what would happen when the world found out. On the massive screen in the living room, the presidential motorcade arrived. The camera panned to the First Lady stepping out of the vehicle. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. The gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk and intricate hand-sewn silver beadwork that caught the light like scattered stars. It was elegant, powerful, and completely original. "That dress is absolutely stunning," one of the senator wives gushed, swirling her champagne glass. "I wonder who the designer is. I heard it was a closely guarded secret." My mother puffed up her chest, soaking in the proximity to power. "Yes, it is simply divine," she purred. "Only the absolute best for the administration. I would not be surprised if it was imported directly from a legacy European house. True luxury is so rare these days." On the screen, the news anchor smiled and adjusted his earpiece. "We are just getting word from the press secretary," he announced, his voice echoing through the surround sound speakers. "We can now officially reveal the designer of this historic gown." In a beautiful nod to homegrown talent, the First Lady is wearing a custom piece by a brilliant young African-American designer, a rising star who is finally stepping into the spotlight. The room leaned in. My mother leaned in, a polite and cultured smile plastered across her face. "The creative genius behind Maison Noire," the anchor continued, "is none other than Washington, D.C. native Nyla Washington." For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to pause. Then my mother choked. The expensive wine she had just sipped sprayed from her mouth in a violent crimson mist. It splattered across her stark white designer dress and rained down onto the pristine white Persian rug she had imported just for this event. She coughed uncontrollably, her eyes bulging as she stared at the screen. The polite chatter in the room instantly evaporated. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt suffocating. Dozens of guests turned their heads, slowly shifting their gaze from the smiling anchor on the television to my mother, who is now gasping for air and clutching her stained chest. "Did he just say?" Nyla Washington, one guest whispered, breaking the dead silence. "Vivica, is that not your daughter? The one who works with old clothes?" Everyone in that room knew exactly how my mother spoke about me. She had spent years telling her social circle that I was a lost cause, a stubborn child who refused to make something of herself. She had painted me as a burden she graciously had to endure. My sister Alicia froze, holding a silver tray of appetizers, her jaw practically resting on the floor. Her wealthy lobbyist husband Preston stood near the bar, his arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. My mother wiped her mouth with a trembling hand, smearing red wine across her chin. "No," she stammered, her voice tight and high-pitched with sudden panic. "No, that must be a mistake." The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, not quite sure how to react to the sudden outburst. A few of the senators' wives discreetly stepped back, pulling their expensive evening gowns away to avoid the spreading puddle of dark merlot seeping into the pristine white fibers of the imported Persian rug. My mother Vivica dropped to her knees. This was a woman who prided herself on absolute control, who never let a single hair fall out of place, and who considered domestic chores entirely beneath her social standing. Yet there she was, frantically dabbing at the crimson stain with a thin cocktail napkin, her perfectly manicured nails catching on the wet, expensive wool. "It is just a coincidence." She let out a forced, breathy laugh that sounded more like a desperate choke. "Washington is a very common last name in this city. And Nyla is, well, it is just a bizarre coincidence." She looked up at the room, her eyes darting from face to face, desperate to find anyone who believed her. "My daughter Nyla is absolutely not a designer. She is barely holding down a normal life. She plays with dirty scraps of old fabric in a damp basement. She does not even know how to match a basic pair of shoes, let alone dress the First Lady of the United States for the most important night of the year." The room remained painfully quiet. The massive television screen behind her was still looping footage of the gorgeous midnight blue gown, but my mother fiercely refused to turn around and look at it again. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing down her ruined dress, trying violently to regain her shattered composure. Alicia, my perfect older sister, quickly stepped in to run interference. She set down her silver tray of artisanal appetizers with a loud clatter and walked over to my mother, linking arms with her to present a united front to the wealthy crowd. "Oh, absolutely," Alicia chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and a practiced smile. "You all know my little sister Nyla. She is, well, she is creatively confused, to put it nicely. The last time we saw her, she was wearing a moth-eaten sweater she found at a cheap thrift store. The girl literally smells like old dust and generic laundry detergent. The idea of her stepping foot inside the White House or touching anything high fashion is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard in my entire life." A few of the guests chuckled nervously, grateful for an excuse to break the awkward silence. The tension in the room began to thaw just a fraction. My family was remarkably good at this. They were absolute masters of manipulation, twisting the narrative until it fit perfectly into their pristine little box of lies. Preston, my wealthy white brother-in-law, swirled his expensive aged whiskey and stepped forward to deliver the final blow. He always loved a captive audience, and as a powerful Washington lobbyist, he knew exactly how to work a room to his advantage. "Please," he said with a highly condescending smirk echoing across his face. "Let us be entirely realistic here, folks. High fashion requires massive capital, it requires deep industry connections, and it requires a certain pedigree. Nyla possesses none of those things. In fact, I generously offered her an entry-level clerical position at my firm, just out of pity because the poor girl has absolutely zero ambition. She declined, of course. She was probably intimidated by a real professional work environment. Trust me, The elegant woman standing behind that brand on the screen is a completely different Nyla Washington, probably someone with actual raw talent and a massive trust fund. The guests nodded slowly, their wealthy sensibilities comforted by Preston and his confident, logical explanation. After all, it made perfect sense to them. The world of high fashion was a fiercely exclusive club, and the idea that the messy, rebellious daughter of Vivica Washington had secretly infiltrated it was simply too absurd to entertain. My mother let out a long, dramatic sigh, pressing a manicured hand to her chest, as if she had just miraculously survived a terrible personal ordeal. "Goodness, what a fright," she said, waving her hand dismissively at the television display. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to have to explain to the press why my estranged daughter was suddenly masquerading as a creative talent. Can you imagine the absolute scandal that would bring to our doorstep? We have a pristine reputation to uphold in this city, a reputation built on pure excellence, not thrift store delusions. The watch party slowly resumed its previous rhythm. The catering staff quietly rushed in with specialized cleaners to scrub the wine stain from the rug, while my mother quickly retreated to the downstairs powder room to change into a backup designer dress she had prepared for the evening. Alicia and Preston continued to mingle seamlessly, making the rounds and ensuring that every single guest understood that the brilliant Nyla Washington on the television was absolutely positively not related to their family in any capacity. They effortlessly turned my name into a casual punchline. For the next 30 minutes, they entertained the elite crowd with highly exaggerated stories of my past failures. Alicia told the politicians' wives about the time I tried to sew my own high school prom dress and ended up looking like a walking patchwork quilt. She conveniently left out the crucial part where she had taken sharp fabric scissors to my original silk design the night before, out of pure spiteful jealousy. Preston entertained the older wealthy donors with a completely fabricated story about how I once practically begged him for a massive loan to start a fake clothing brand, and how he had to sit me down and teach me basic economics like a child. It was all a complete lie. I had never asked that arrogant man for a single dime in my entire existence. But the actual truth did not matter to them at all. What mattered was the public performance. They needed to ruthlessly tear me down to build themselves up. They desperately needed me to be the ultimate failure so they could comfortably remain the gold standard of success. In the marble powder room, my mother stared intensely at her reflection in the gilded mirror. She applied a fresh coat of expensive red lipstick, trying desperately to ignore the tiny, piercing voice of doubt creeping into the dark corners of her mind. She told herself repeatedly that I was nothing. She convinced herself that the brilliant designer the news anchor had praised was just a phantom, a total stranger who just happened to share my exact name. She had to firmly believe that lie, because the alternative was entirely and completely unacceptable to her fragile ego. If I actually was the creative genius behind Maison Noire, it meant that everything she had ever said about me was completely wrong. It meant that burning my clothes 8 years ago was not an act of tough maternal love, but an act of sheer, blinding cruelty. And Vivica Washington never, ever admitted to being wrong. She stepped back out into the bright living room, her head held impossibly high, a fresh glass of sparkling champagne resting in her hand. The party was back in full swing. The soft jazz music was playing lightly in the background, and the various conversations had safely shifted away from the presidential inauguration and back to local political gossip and rising stock portfolios. The sudden crisis had been officially averted. The grand illusion of the perfect affluent family was completely intact. They felt incredibly safe. They felt completely secure in their insulated bubble of immense wealth and blind arrogance. They genuinely believed that the sad ghost of the daughter they had thrown away would never actually return to haunt them. They truly thought the night would end with polite goodbyes and self-congratulatory pats on the back. But they had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them just on the other side of those heavy mahogany front doors. They had no idea that while they were busy laughing at my expense and drinking their expensive champagne, I was already walking up their sprawling circular driveway. The exact same driveway I had been forcefully banished from 8 years ago. And I was definitely not wearing rags. The heavy mahogany front doors did not just open, they swung wide with a heavy resonant thud that cut through the soft jazz music floating across the living room. A sudden rush of crisp evening air swept into the warm, heavily perfumed space, carrying with it an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Every head in the grand foyer turned simultaneously, drawn by the sudden noise and the commanding presence standing perfectly still in the doorframe. I stepped over the threshold into the bright light of the chandelier. I was not wearing the moth-eaten sweater Alicia had so graciously described to her wealthy friends. I was not covered in the dirt and dust of a damp basement. Instead, I was wearing a razor-sharp custom-tailored power suit spun from the finest obsidian wool. The cut was immaculate, entirely hand-stitched in my Paris atelier, hugging my frame with a fierce, unapologetic elegance that screamed quiet luxury. There were no flashy logos or gaudy designer tags. True wealth does not need to announce itself, and the people in that room, the politicians, the socialites, the old money heirs, recognized that immediately. They recognized the drape of the fabric, the flawless precision of the seams, the undeniable aura of a woman who completely owned her space. The polite chatter died instantly for the second time that night. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased. It was as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the massive room. People parted naturally, creating a wide, clear path for me as I slowly walked forward. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, a steady, hypnotic beat that echoed in the suffocating silence. I did not rush. I did not look down. My chin was tilted up and my eyes locked dead ahead. I was completely serene, untouched by the anxiety that used to paralyze me in this very house. I watched as my mother Vivica slowly turned around, her hand still gripping a fresh glass of champagne. The polite, cultured smile she had just spent the last 20 minutes painstakingly rebuilding completely collapsed. It did not just fade, it shattered. Her jaw dropped slightly, and all the color drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of sheer terror and absolute disbelief, darted frantically up and down, taking in my tailored suit, my sleek hair, my unbothered expression. The glass in her hand trembled so violently that tiny drops of golden liquid spilled over the edge and splashed onto her backup designer dress. She could not speak. The woman who always had a cutting remark, a cruel joke, or a masterful manipulation ready on the tip of her tongue was utterly paralyzed. Alicia stood frozen next to the catered buffet, her fingers white-knuckling a silver serving spoon. The $15,000 dress she had been bragging about suddenly looked cheap in comparison to the bespoke masterpiece I was wearing. The intense, raw jealousy radiating from her was almost palpable. She had spent her entire life trying to outshine me, following our mother's toxic playbook step by step to secure her status as the golden child. And yet, in a single silent moment, I had completely eclipsed her. Beside her, Preston looked as though he had just seen a ghost. The condescending smirk he wore like a second skin had completely vanished, replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. His eyes narrowed, trying to reconcile the pathetic narrative he had just spun for the senators with the powerful, intimidating woman standing right in front of him. He opened his mouth to say something, probably a reflex, to assert his dominance, but no words came out. I did not say a single word either. I did not have to. My absolute silence was my greatest weapon. For years, I had tried to scream my truth in this house. I had tried to logically explain myself. I had cried and begged for them to just see me as a human being. But arguing with toxic people only feeds their ego. It gives them the validation that they still have power over your emotions. By refusing to speak, by simply existing in my ultimate success, I stripped them of all their power. I was no longer the frightened little girl begging for her mother's approval. I was the creative director of an international fashion house, a woman who had just dressed the First Lady of the United States. And I was standing in their living room, watching their carefully constructed lies crumble into dust. The wealthy guests began to whisper among themselves, but the tone had completely changed. The mocking chuckles were gone, replaced by genuine awe and rapid, curious speculation. The senator wife who had praised the First Lady gown earlier took a tentative step forward, her eyes wide with recognition. She looked from the television screen, which was still showing close-ups of my midnight blue masterpiece, back to me, and then over to my horrified mother. The terrifying realization of the truth was slowly dawning on the entire room. They were putting the pieces together, matching the confident, brilliant designer the news anchor had described with the confident, elegant woman standing in the center of the room. They realized that Vivica Washington had not just been mistaken, she had been lying to their faces all along. I stopped right in the middle of the room, allowing the heavy silence to stretch out until it became almost physically painful. I looked at Alicia, then at Preston, and finally I locked eyes with my mother. All the years of emotional abuse, the gaslighting, the cruel comparisons, the moment she threw my clothes into that blazing fire, it all hung in the air between us. She looked at me with pure desperation, silently pleading with me not to expose her any further in front of her high society friends. But the time for protecting her fragile ego was long gone. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity for them. I could see the exact moment my mother realized that her entire social standing, the very thing she worshipped more than her own children, was dangling by a single fragile thread, and I was the one holding the scissors. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently and so completely that the air felt thick and heavy. I did not need to scream or cry to claim my victory. The beautiful bespoke suit on my back, the confident posture, the unwavering eye contact, they were all screaming my success for me. I let her drown in the silence for just a moment longer, letting her fully absorb the undeniable reality that the daughter she threw away like trash was now standing at the very top of the world looking down at her. My mother broke the silence first. The sheer instinct of self-preservation kicked in, overriding her shock. She suddenly lunged forward, her manicured hands reaching out to grab my arm with a desperate claw-like grip. Her perfectly sculpted nails dug into the fine wool of my custom sleeve. "Nyla," she whispered, her voice a frantic, strained hiss that barely concealed the raw panic bubbling just beneath the surface. "We need to talk right now in the kitchen." She did not wait for my answer. She yanked my arm, trying to physically drag me away from the center of the room and out of the piercing gaze of her wealthy guests. Years ago, I would have stumbled blindly behind her, terrified of her anger. I would have apologized repeatedly just to keep the peace. But tonight, I planted my feet firmly on the marble floor. I did not budge an inch. My mother jolted backward, caught off guard by my sudden immovable weight. She looked back at me, her eyes wide and wild, silently begging me to comply. I calmly looked down at her hand, gripping my arm, and then I looked back up into her eyes. I gently but forcefully pried her fingers off my jacket. "Lead the way, Vivica," I said, my voice perfectly even and loud enough for the closest senators' wives to hear. "I would love a tour of the catering setup." Her face flashed with pure humiliation as I used her first name. But she had no other choice. She quickly spun around and practically sprinted toward the swinging wooden doors that led to the massive chef's kitchen. I followed behind her at my own leisurely pace, leaving the stunned silence of the living room behind us. Alicia and Preston immediately trailed closely behind me, hovering like anxious guard dogs, terrified of what I might say or do next. The moment the heavy kitchen doors swung shut behind us, cutting off the soft jazz music and the prying eyes of the politicians, the thick facade completely dropped. The kitchen was a chaotic mess of stainless steel counters, half-empty catering trays, and nervous staff members who immediately froze when we burst into the room. The smell of expensive catered food, heavy truffles, and roasted meats hung thick in the warm air, making my stomach turn slightly. It was the smell of pure excess, the smell of a family desperately trying to prove they belong to a world that would never truly accept them. My mother fiercely clapped her hands together, pointing sharply at the kitchen staff. "Everybody out!" she commanded, her voice shaking with raw fury. "Out right this second!" The waiters and chefs quickly abandoned their prep stations, rushing out the back service door into the cold night air without saying a single word. They knew better than to cross Vivica Washington when she was on the verge of a total meltdown. As soon as the heavy metal door clicked shut behind the last waiter, my mother whirled around to face me. The polite high society host was completely gone. The monster I grew up with, the woman who ruled our home with emotional terror, was back. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled from her frantic movements. She could not handle the fact that I was not reacting to her anger. My calmness was completely destroying her. For her entire life, anger was her currency. If she screamed, you cried. If she demanded, you obeyed. That was the established law of our household. But I was no longer a citizen of her toxic little kingdom. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, taking a threatening step toward me. Her voice was a venomous whisper, desperate to keep the volume low enough so the guests in the next room could not hear. "Why are you here, Nyla? Who invited you into my home? Did you actually come all the way here just to humiliate me in front of the most important people in this city?" I stood perfectly still, letting her angry words wash over me. It was fascinating to watch her unravel. For my entire life, she had projected this image of absolute flawless perfection. She convinced the world that she was an untouchable queen. But looking at her now, all I saw was a deeply insecure woman, terrified of losing her imaginary crown. "I am not here to humiliate you," I replied, my voice calm and completely devoid of the emotional hysteria she was desperately trying to provoke. "I did not even know you were having a party tonight. I am just here to collect what belongs to me." Alicia pushed past her husband, stepping right into my personal space. Her eyes were narrowed into venomous slits. "Do not play games with us, Nyla." She snapped, her voice trembling with intense jealousy. "You orchestrated this whole thing. You knew the news was going to break tonight. You purposely timed your little dramatic entrance to ruin Mom's big night. You are just a bitter, vindictive little girl who cannot stand the fact that we moved on and became successful without you." I looked at my sister, taking in her cheap $15,000 dress and the tense defensive posture of her wealthy husband standing right behind her. Preston crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back against the expensive imported refrigerator. He looked me up and down, trying to find a crack in my armor, trying to find the frightened little girl he used to mock relentlessly. But there was nothing there for him to exploit anymore. They were so incredibly predictable. Their entire reality was built on the fundamental belief that I was beneath them. They could not fathom a universe where my success was entirely independent of their existence. They genuinely believed I was still obsessed with earning their approval. "Success," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue slowly. I tilted my head, studying Alicia as if she were a strange exhibit in a museum. "You think I care about your watch party, Alicia? You think I spent the last 6 years building an international fashion house just so I could come back here and ruin a local socialite gathering? The ego it takes to believe my life revolves around you is honestly astounding." My mother slammed her hand down on the stainless steel counter, making a loud, sharp noise that echoed in the empty kitchen. "Do not speak to your sister that way," she growled, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "I do not care what kind of lucky break you stumbled into over in Europe. I do not care if they put your name on the television. You are still my daughter. You are still the same ungrateful, disrespectful child who refused to conform to the standards of this family. You are embarrassing me right now with this ridiculous attitude." She stepped closer, her face flushed with pure toxic rage. "I built this family," she whispered, her eyes burning with intensity. "I sacrificed everything to give you and your sister the best possible life. I curated our image, I secured our status, and I made sure the Washington name meant something in this town. And you threw it all away, for what? to play dress up, to make clothes for strangers. You should be on your knees thanking me for the tough love I gave you. I did not blink. I did not look away. I just stared at the woman who had caused me so much pain for so many years. The kitchen felt suffocatingly hot, but my blood ran completely cold. The silence between us stretched out tight as a piano wire ready to snap at the slightest touch. I was finally ready to burn their house of cards straight to the ground. My mother took my silence as a direct challenge. She stepped even closer to me until I could actually smell the sour undertones of the expensive red wine on her breath. The veins in her neck were visibly throbbing. She pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my chest, her polished fingernails stopping just an inch from the lapel of my jacket. You think you can just waltz in here wearing a fake designer suit and pretend you are better than us? She hissed, her face twisting into a mask of pure spite. You think I do not know exactly who you are beneath all of this? You are the exact same pathetic little girl who used to drag actual garbage into my pristine house. I burned your trashy thrifted clothes in the backyard 8 years ago to save this family reputation. Vivica practically spat the words at me, discarding any remaining shred of maternal warmth. I watched you cry over those worthless rags, and I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did it to protect us. I did it because you were a walking embarrassment to the Washington name. You were running around this city looking like a homeless beggar while I was trying to build a legacy. Her words echoed sharply off the cold stainless steel appliances and the marble countertops of the massive kitchen. 8 years ago, those exact words would have shattered me into a million irreparable pieces. I remembered that terrible night so vividly. I was barely 20 years old. I had spent an entire year quietly collecting vintage fabrics, going to estate sales, and digging through dusty thrift stores, saving every single penny I had to buy unique materials I could practice on. I was secretly building my very first design portfolio in the damp basement of this very house. And while I was out working a minimum wage retail job, my mother and Alicia had dragged all of my mannequins, my sketchbooks, and my carefully curated fabrics out into the backyard. They poured lighter fluid over my absolute biggest dreams, and they set them on fire. I remembered running up the driveway and seeing the thick black smoke rising above the manicured hedges. I remembered the suffocating chemical smell of burning silk and melting polyester. I remembered falling to my knees on the perfect green lawn, weeping and begging them to pull my sketchbooks out of the fire, while Alicia just stood there holding a garden hose with a cold, highly satisfied smirk on her flawless face. My mother had stood next to the flames looking down at me like I was a disgusting insect that she had finally squashed. You think a fake designer suit changes who you are? Vivica continued, her voice rising higher in pitch as she fed on her own toxic energy. You can put a stray dog in a diamond collar, but it is still just a stray dog. You are a total fraud, Nyla. You saw an incredible opportunity to steal someone else's identity on national television tonight, and you took it just to ruin my perfect evening. I simply looked at her. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to passionately defend myself or validate her ridiculous accusations. The absolute desperation in her eyes was almost tragic to witness. She was fighting so incredibly hard to keep me inside the tiny, insignificant box she had built for me. Because if I successfully escaped that box, her entire worldview would instantly collapse. She desperately needed me to be a failure. Her fragile identity as a superior, successful mother depended entirely on my constant misery. You burned my clothes, Vivica, I said softly, letting the harsh reality of her confession hang in the heavy, stifling air of the kitchen. You destroyed months of my hard work and broke your own child heart because you were terrified of what the wealthy neighbors might whisper behind your back. You traded your own flesh and blood for the cheap approval of women sitting in the next room who do not even genuinely like you. Mom did exactly what she had to do, Alicia snapped, stepping up right beside our mother like a loyal, obedient soldier. You were completely out of control, Nyla. You were hoarding actual trash in the basement and calling it high art. We were just trying to stage an intervention to force you to wake up and live in the real world. The real world. I repeated slowly, scanning the absurdly expensive kitchen, and then looking at the two women standing in front of me wearing outfits that cost more than a standard college tuition. Your real world is built entirely on maxed out credit cards and empty social validation. You burned my clothes because you were absolutely terrified, Alicia. You both looked at the raw things I created in that damp basement, and you saw actual talent. You saw something deeply authentic, and it terrified you to your core because nothing in this massive house has ever been real. That is a disgusting lie, Vivica shrieked, slamming her flat hand down on the metal counter again. You have absolutely no talent. You have never had any talent. You are completely delusional. I did not argue with her. I just let her chest heave aggressively as she tried to catch her breath. The beautiful cinematic irony of the situation washed over me in a wave of profound peace. She honestly thought that burning my fabrics would stop my momentum. She genuinely believed that turning my very first creations into gray ash would force me to give up my dreams and become a compliant little accessory for her endless social climbing schemes. She did not understand that the massive fire she set that night did not destroy my ambition. It permanently crystallized it. The bitter smell of that thick black smoke had lingered in my memory for 8 long, arduous years, pushing me to work harder and stay awake longer than anyone else in the Paris fashion district. She thought she was burning my entire future, but she was actually just lighting the massive furnace of my ultimate success. I watched her standing there trembling with blind rage and fierce denial. And for the very first time in my entire life, I did not feel a single drop of anger or resentment toward my mother. I just felt a deep, overwhelming sense of pity for a woman who was so blind she could not even recognize the empire her own daughter had built. The heavy swinging door of the kitchen pushed open again, breaking the thick silence I had just draped over my mother. Preston strolled in, looking entirely too comfortable in a house that was completely falling apart. He took a slow, arrogant sip from his crystal glass of amber whiskey, the ice clinking loudly in the quiet room. He let out a long, exasperated sigh, like a disappointed father dealing with an unruly toddler. "All right, let us all just take a deep breath and dial down the drama in here," he said, his voice thick with unearned authority, and that classic condescending tone he always used on me. He walked over and placed a reassuring hand on Alicia's shoulder, acting like the great white savior stepping in to protect his wealthy, fragile wife and mother-in-law from the angry black sheep of the family. He looked at me with an expression of deep manufactured pity. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, his eyes tracing the clean lines of my tailored suit with obvious disdain. "Listen to me, Nyla." He began speaking slowly and clearly, as if I lacked the basic cognitive ability to understand normal English. "We all know you have a vivid imagination. We know you like to make up these grand little stories to make yourself feel better about where you ended up in life. But this is Washington, D.C. This city is for serious people. It is built on real capital, real influence, and real pedigree. You cannot just walk into a room wearing a decent knockoff suit and expect everyone to suddenly believe you are rubbing elbows with the president." I watched him pace the kitchen floor, completely enamored with the sound of his own voice. He genuinely believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. He was a legacy lobbyist, a man who was handed his entire career and his wealth by his father. He had never built anything from scratch in his entire life, but he felt completely entitled to lecture me about hard work and reality. "Vivica and Alicia are right to be upset," he continued, leaning his hip against the marble island and crossing his ankles. "You come in here right in the middle of a highly sensitive political networking event, and you try to pull a stunt like this. It shows a complete lack of maturity and a fundamental misunderstanding of how the world actually works. Whoever that designer was on the television, it was obviously not you. Maybe it was a cheap public relations stunt, or maybe it was a massive misunderstanding by the press corps. But we all know the truth. We know the girl who failed out of her basic responsibilities and hid in a dirty basement playing with fabric scraps." My mother and sister watched him with visible relief. They were practically vibrating with gratitude. Preston was doing exactly what they needed him to do. He was using his deep, confident voice and his polished corporate vocabulary to re-establish the natural order of things. He was attempting to put me firmly back in my place beneath their expensive shoes. He was wrapping their toxic family dynamic in a neat, logical bow so they did not have to face the terrifying truth standing right in front of them. "I am going to do you a massive favor," Nyla Preston said, setting his empty glass down on the granite counter with a loud thud. "I am going to offer you a way out of this pathetic delusion you are trapped in. My lobbying firm is expanding our offices downtown. We handle massive government defense contracts. It is a real business for real professionals. We just fired our overnight cleaning crew because they were completely incompetent. I can make a single phone call right now and get you on the payroll as a janitor." Alicia smirked proudly, crossing her arms over her chest and looking at me down her nose. "You should take it, Nyla," she sneered. "It is probably the best offer you will ever get in your entire life. It is certainly better than digging through garbage bins for used clothes." "It is honest work," Preston added, nodding his head solemnly as if he were handing me the keys to the entire city. "You will get a steady minimum wage paycheck, and maybe you will finally learn what it means to actually work for a living instead of playing dress-up and begging for attention. You can sweep the floors where real power is made. Maybe some of that reality will finally rub off on you and you can stop torturing your mother with these ridiculous fantasies. Consider it an act of charity from the family you treat so poorly." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the warm air of the kitchen. The three of them stood there aligned like a solid brick wall of pure arrogance and delusion. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the tears to fall, for the angry screams to escape my throat. They wanted me to lash out so they could point their manicured fingers and call me crazy. That was always their favorite weapon. They would push me and mock me until I finally reacted, and then they would use my emotional reaction to prove to everyone that I was the unstable problem. But I did not react the way they desperately wanted me to. I did not scream, and I did not cry. I did not even frown. I simply smiled at him. It was a cold, calculated smile that did not reach my eyes. I looked at this arrogant man who thought his skin color and his old money made him an untouchable god in this city. He thought he was holding all the cards because he had always held all the cards. He had absolutely no idea that the very ground he was standing on had already collapsed beneath his expensive leather shoes. He had no idea that the lobbying firm he was so incredibly proud of was currently bleeding millions of dollars in lost contracts. He was so busy trying to play the benevolent white savior to my deeply flawed family that he could not see the massive financial tidal wave rushing straight toward him. I slowly let my hand drop to my side, feeling the heavy silence stretch out between us, knowing that his pathetic offer was the final nail in his own coffin. I kept my eyes locked on Preston, letting my cold smile fade into a perfectly blank expression. The kitchen was so quiet, you could hear the low hum of the expensive imported refrigerator. "You are offering me a job as a janitor, Preston?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but echoing clearly against the tile walls. "A job sweeping the floors of Harrington and Associates." He puffed out his chest and nodded proudly, clearly expecting me to thank him for his incredible generosity. "Yes, Nyla," he replied, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Someone has to clean up the messes of important people." I took a single, slow step toward him, closing the distance just enough to make him subconsciously shift his weight. "It is a very generous offer, Preston," I said smoothly. "But I am not quite sure how you plan to pay my minimum wage salary when your firm is currently drowning in massive debt." His proud posture stiffened immediately. Alicia let out a sharp laugh, rolling her eyes. "What are you even talking about, Nyla?" she scoffed. "Preston runs one of the most successful lobbying firms in Washington." I did not look at my sister. I kept my gaze pinned entirely on him, watching the color slowly drain from his arrogant face. Harrington and Associates closed at $14.20 a share. This afternoon I recited clinically, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Down 42% since the beginning of the third quarter. You lost the massive aerospace contract last month because your lead negotiator was caught embezzling funds." 2 weeks ago, the Department of Defense officially pulled out of your cybersecurity initiative, leaving you with an $8 million deficit. And just yesterday morning, your top 3 senior partners quietly tendered their resignations, effectively gutting your entire operational staff. The silence in the kitchen became absolute. Vivica stopped breathing. Alicia looked from me to her husband, a deep, confused frown forming on her forehead. Preston, I am sure it is just a minor setback. I continued, tilting my head slightly. But taking out a massive high-interest loan against your own personal assets to cover the firm operating costs seems like a desperate move for a man who claims to hold so much power in this city. Preston stood there completely paralyzed. His jaw was tightly clenched and a single drop of sweat formed near his hairline. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, entirely unable to form a coherent sentence. The confident, wealthy lobbyist, who had just offered me a mop and a bucket, was suddenly looking at me as if I were a terrifying monster that had just crawled out of his darkest nightmares. "How do you know that?" Alicia demanded, her voice shaking slightly as she looked at her pale husband. "Preston, tell her she is lying. Tell her she is just making up crazy numbers to scare us." But Preston could not speak. He was entirely exposed. He had spent the last 6 months desperately hiding his massive financial failures from his wife and his mother-in-law. He had kept up the charade of the wealthy, successful provider buying Alicia $15,000 dresses and funding Vivica and her lavish watch parties, all while secretly bleeding cash. And now the failure he despised was casually reciting his highly classified corporate secrets in the middle of a catered kitchen. "How on earth could you possibly know about the internal partner resignations?" Preston finally choked out, his voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. "That information is heavily restricted. It has not even gone to the board of directors yet." I smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it at all. It was the smile of an apex predator circling its wounded prey. "You underestimate me, Preston," I said softly. "You always have. You look at me and you see the girl you used to bully. You see the easy target. You are so blinded by your own arrogance and your precious old money pedigree that you never bother to look at the people you step on. You think the world only exists inside your private country clubs and your exclusive boardrooms." I took another slow step forward, forcing him to press his back against the granite counter. "The luxury fashion industry is not just about making pretty dresses. Preston," I explained, my voice smooth and lethal, "it is a multi-billion-dollar global ecosystem. We share investors with aerospace firms. Our hedge fund managers sit on the same advisory boards as your defense contractors. Information flows freely when you are sitting at the head of the table. The people you answer to, the men you beg for contracts, they are the exact same people who heavily invest in my collections." Vivica leaned against the stainless steel sink, looking as if she were about to genuinely faint. The pristine image of her wealthy, perfect son-in-law was rapidly dissolving right before her eyes. "Preston, is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. "Are you really losing the firm?" Preston ignored her. His eyes were locked on me, filled with a frantic, desperate energy. He was trying to calculate how much damage I could actually do. He was trying to figure out if I was just bluffing, or if I genuinely held the power to destroy him. "You are lying," he spat, trying to muster a shred of his former bravado, but his voice cracked terribly. "You are a high school dropout who sews rags in a basement. You do not know anything about high finance or government contracts. You are just regurgitating rumors you heard somewhere." I reached into the inner pocket of my custom-tailored jacket. My movements were slow and deliberate. I pulled out my sleek smartphone and tapped the screen a few times, bringing up a highly secure financial dashboard. I held the phone out toward him, keeping it just out of his reach. "Read it, Preston," I commanded softly. He leaned forward, his eyes frantically scanning the glowing screen. The dashboard displayed the real-time plummeting metrics of his firm, along with flagged notices from major creditors. It was raw, unassailable data pulled directly from the private equity firm that handled my personal wealth management. His breathing became shallow and erratic. His hands began to shake so badly he had to grip the edge of the granite counter to keep himself upright. "You see, Preston?" I continued, putting the phone back into my pocket. "I do not need to make things up. The truth is already damning enough. You built your entire identity on the illusion of success, while looking down on me for actually trying to build something real. You laughed when my mother burned my work. You mocked me when I left this city with nothing. And now you are standing here totally bankrupt both financially and morally, offering me a job cleaning your empty office." Alicia grabbed his arm, digging her expensive nails into his suit jacket. "Preston," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the kitchen. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me we are not broke. We just bought the summer house in the Hamptons. We have a payment due next week." Preston violently yanked his arm away from her, his face twisting with sudden rage and deep humiliation. "Shut up, Alicia," he snapped, losing complete control of his polished persona. "Just shut up for 1 single minute." The golden child stumbled back, utterly shocked by her husband's sudden unhinged aggression. Vivica gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. The perfect family was imploding from the inside out, and I had barely even lifted a finger. I had simply held up a tiny mirror to their lies and let them tear each other apart. Alicia stood there staring at the man she had married solely for his status and wealth. The shiny veneer of her perfect marriage was cracking wide open, exposing the rotten core underneath. She had spent years mocking my clothes and my ambitions because she felt entirely secure in her luxury bubble. And now that bubble had just violently popped. I watched the panic settle over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. For years, they had used money as a weapon against me. They had used their wealth to prove that they were superior and I was inferior. But the universe has a very strange way of balancing the books. "You should really take better care of your business, Preston," I whispered, leaning in slightly. "The janitor position you offered me might be the only job you are qualified for by the end of the month." The heavy silence in the kitchen was suddenly shattered by Alicia. She had spent her entire life carefully curating a flawless reality where she was the untouchable princess, and any threat to that reality had to be immediately neutralized. She simply could not process the fact that her wealthy husband was currently standing in front of her, completely exposed as a massive financial failure. Her brain completely rejected the terrifying information. Instead of confronting the truth about her crumbling marriage and her vanishing bank accounts, she directed all of her blind panic and venom straight at me. She forcefully pushed her way between Preston and me, stepping directly into my line of sight. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling, as she desperately tried to pull her shattered, arrogant persona back together. She ran her manicured hands down the sides of her elaborate evening gown, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles. The dress was a massive, voluminous creation of dark emerald fabric covered in heavy sequins and intricate lace detailing. To the untrained eye of her wealthy local friends, it looked like a masterpiece of high fashion. To her, it was an impenetrable suit of armor. It was physical, tangible proof that she was still superior to the sister she despised. "You are so full of lies!" Nyla, Alicia sneered, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperate anger and forced superiority. "You come in here spouting fake numbers and waving your little phone around trying to convince us that Preston is broke. But you are the only fraud standing in this room. You always have been. You are so jealous of my life and my marriage that you will literally make up anything just to tear us down." She took a step closer to me, aggressively invading my personal space. She grabbed a handful of the heavy emerald fabric of her skirt and held it up right in front of my face like a twisted trophy. "Do you see this dress?" she demanded, her voice echoing sharply against the tile walls. "Do you have any actual idea what this is or how much it costs? Of course you do not, because you spent your entire life digging through charity bins. This is an exclusive custom piece from Maison Noire. She paused, letting the name of my own fashion house hang in the heavy air, expecting me to cower in pure intimidation. My mother, Vivica, suddenly stood up a little straighter, grasping onto Alicia's words like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. The mere mention of the luxury brand gave them both a sudden surge of toxic confidence. Preston bought this for me just last month. Alicia continued, a smug, triumphant smile slowly spreading across her face. He did not buy it off the rack like some common shopper. He used his high-level international connections. He wired $15,000 directly to a senior VIP liaison in their Paris showroom. An exclusive contact that only deals with top-tier political clients. They overnighted it directly to our penthouse in a silk garment bag. She turned slightly to look at Preston, expecting him to nod and validate her grand story to regain his footing. But Preston was still staring blindly at the floor, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire life burn to the ground. Alicia completely ignored his terrifying silence and turned her venomous gaze back to me. "So let us think about this logically for one single second," Alicia said, tapping her perfectly manicured finger against her chin in a highly mocking gesture. "You are standing here claiming to be the secret creative genius behind the very same fashion house that made this magnificent gown. You expect us to believe that you are the director of Maison Noire." But when Preston spoke to his VIP contact in Paris, a man who handles the most exclusive custom orders for the brand, he never once mentioned your name. He said the head designer was a highly reclusive European artist. He laughed when Preston casually mentioned he had a sister-in-law who liked to play with cheap fabrics. Vivica stepped forward, joining her golden child. Her panic from moments ago was rapidly morphing back into her comfortable, familiar arrogance. "Alicia is absolutely right," she chimed in, crossing her arms over her chest. "If you were really running that massive company, Preston would have known. His contacts would have told him immediately. You are just a pathetic little liar, Nyla. You probably read about the brand in some cheap magazine and decided to steal their name to impress a room full of people who actually matter." They were so incredibly proud of themselves. They had completely ignored the massive financial bombs I had just dropped and pivoted entirely to the one thing they thought they understood better than me: luxury fashion and public perception. Alicia paraded back and forth in the narrow kitchen space, making sure the bright overhead lights caught the shimmering sequins of her heavy emerald dress. She was practically glowing with toxic satisfaction, convinced she had just masterfully exposed my massive lie and protected her fragile social standing. "Look at the detailing, Nyla," Alicia taunted, holding out her arm to show off the intricate lace sleeve. "Look at the heavy beadwork. This is what real raw talent looks like. This is what $15,000 of pure luxury feels like. You could study fashion for the next 50 years, and you would never be able to afford a single thread of a dress like this, let alone actually design it yourself. You thought you could come in here and destroy my perfect husband, but all you did was prove how utterly desperate and pathetic you still are." I stood perfectly still, letting her arrogant words wash over me like a warm breeze. I did not interrupt her little fashion show. I just watched her parade around the catering kitchen in her heavy emerald gown. I let my eyes travel slowly over the garment, tracing the rigid, uneven seams, taking in the awkward, stiff drape of the synthetic fabric, and examining the shiny plastic backing of the cheap sequins she was so incredibly proud of. She honestly believed that throwing the name Maison Noire in my face was the ultimate trump card. She thought that flexing a massive $15,000 price tag would instantly put me back in my place as the worthless little sister. She had absolutely no idea that she had just willingly walked right into the sharpest trap I had ever set. I kept my expression completely blank, but inside, I was finally smiling. The sheer poetic justice of this exact moment was almost too perfect to be real. They desperately wanted to talk about the dress, and I was more than happy to oblige them. I took a slow, deliberate step toward my sister, closing the narrow gap between us. Alicia stood her ground, tilting her chin up defiantly, completely convinced she had just won the ultimate victory. She thrust her hip out, letting the harsh fluorescent catering lights reflect off the heavy sequins of her emerald gown. "It is a very bold color, Alicia," I said softly, raising my right hand. Before she could pull away or slap my arm down, I reached out and firmly pinched the thick fabric near her collarbone. I rolled the stiff material between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the rigid, unnatural friction of cheap synthetic fibers. A genuine Maison Noire gown is spun from pure organic silk and hand-dyed in the south of France. It feels like cool water against the bare skin. Your dress feels like melted plastic. "How dare you touch me?" Alicia hissed, trying to yank the heavy fabric out of my grip. But I held on tight and swiftly flipped her inner collar inside out, exposing the hidden seam resting against her neck. I did not even need to look closely, because the evidence was completely glaring. "You see this stitching, Alicia?" I asked, pointing to the frayed, uneven white thread binding the heavy collar together. At Maison Noire, we only use single-strand silk thread, perfectly matched to the exact hex code of the garment. We do not use highly abrasive polyester thread, and we absolutely never use industrial fabric glue to secure our sequin panels. I traced my finger down the rigid zipper line on her back. Furthermore, every single custom piece we create carries a unique digital tracking tag woven seamlessly into the lower left hem. It registers the exact artisan who crafted it and the specific elite client who purchased it. Your dress has a generic paper tag poorly sewn into the neckline with a barcode that links directly to a wholesale mass production factory in Guangzhou, China. Furthermore, your dress smells faintly of highly toxic industrial adhesive. Alicia snatched her collar back, her eyes wide and deeply panicked. She looked down at her dress, suddenly seeing the cheap, glaring flaws I had just pointed out to her. "No," she stammered, taking a step back, her voice trembling. "No, Preston bought this directly from the Paris showroom. He showed me the digital receipt. He paid $15,000 for it." I shifted my cold gaze from my trembling sister to her utterly defeated husband. Preston was leaning heavily against the kitchen counter, looking like he might physically vomit. His face was entirely drained of blood. "Oh, I am sure he showed you a receipt, Alicia," I said, my voice echoing with icy calm. But Preston did not wire $15,000 to a Paris VIP contact. He sent $500 to a black market distributor online, and he quietly pocketed the remaining $14,500 for himself. Vivica let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. Alicia shook her head violently, refusing to accept the terrifying reality. "Why would he do that?" she demanded, her voice cracking under the immense pressure. "Why would my wealthy husband buy me a fake dress?" "Because your husband has a crippling offshore gambling problem." "Alicia," I revealed, watching Preston flinch as if I had just struck him physically across the face. That massive deficit at his lobbying firm was not just from lost government contracts. He has been quietly siphoning money from your personal accounts to pay off highly aggressive creditors in Atlantic City. He could not afford to buy you a real designer gown without completely draining your joint savings account. So he bought you a cheap knockoff to keep you quiet, and used the rest of the stolen cash to cover his massive gambling debts. The kitchen fell so silent you could hear the rapid, shallow breathing of my mother and sister. Alicia looked at the cheap emerald fabric pooling around her expensive shoes, and then she slowly raised her eyes to look at the man she had married solely for his status. Preston reached a shaking, pale hand out toward her. "Baby," he pleaded, his voice weak and completely pathetic. "Baby, please listen to me. It is not what it sounds like. It was just a temporary cash flow issue. I can explain everything to you." Alicia did not let him finish his pathetic sentence. The pristine facade of the golden child completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, humiliated rage and violently lunged forward. She slammed her hands into his chest, pushing him so hard his back hit the stainless steel refrigerator with a massive, terrifying thud. "You lied to me," she shrieked, her voice entirely unrecognizable as she abandoned all of her high society grace. "You let me walk into a room full of powerful senators' wives wearing garbage. You let me brag about a cheap fake dress in front of my own family." Preston tried to grab her wrist to stop her, but she was completely unhinged. She slapped him across the face with the flat of her hand, the sharp crack echoing loudly off the tile walls. My mother, Vivica, rushed forward, trying desperately to pull her golden child away from her wealthy white savior, but Alicia shoved our mother aside with incredible force. "You spent my money, you pathetic loser!" Alicia screamed, crying hysterically as she clawed at his expensive suit jacket, ripping the lapel. "You told me we were elite. You told me we were untouchable." I stood perfectly still, watching the entire chaotic scene unfold with absolute emotional detachment. The people who had spent their entire lives mocking me, making me feel incredibly small and worthless, were now physically destroying each other over a cheap piece of fabric and a mountain of terrifying financial lies. They had worshipped money and superficial status for so long that the moment it was violently stripped away, they had absolutely nothing real left to hold on to. Preston was bleeding from a deep scratch on his cheek, frantically trying to dodge his wife's manic, violent blows. Vivica was sobbing uncontrollably, begging them to stop before the politicians in the living room heard the massive commotion. The magnificent watch party had officially turned into a complete psychological nightmare for my toxic family. But I was not finished tearing down their pathetic illusions. They genuinely thought the fake dress and the gambling debts were the absolute worst of their immediate problems. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to take away the very roof over their heads. Preston violently pushed Alicia away from him, finally managing to break free from her frantic scratching and hitting. His chest was heaving, and the deep scratch on his cheek was beginning to well up with bright red blood. He was entirely backed into a corner. His massive ego shattered, his financial crimes exposed to his wife and mother-in-law. But instead of showing any genuine remorse or taking accountability for destroying his own life, he turned all of his blinding, terrifying rage directly onto me. His face turned a violent shade of crimson, the veins in his thick neck bulging against his torn collar. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "You are a trespasser!" He roared, his voice echoing so loudly the stainless steel pots hanging above the island seemed to vibrate. "You broke into this house to extort us. You fabricated all of this garbage just to ruin my marriage and terrorize this family." He reached into his tailored pants pocket and frantically pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it onto the tile floor. "I am calling the police right now," Preston spat, tapping the screen with aggressive, erratic movements. "I am having you arrested for criminal trespassing and corporate espionage. You are going to spend the next 10 years in a federal prison, you pathetic little fraud. I will make sure the judges in this city lock you away forever. I know the chief of police personally, Nyla. He is sitting in the living room drinking my champagne right now." Vivica snapped out of her crying fit, wiping her mascara-stained face with the back of her hand. "Yes. Preston, call them," she pleaded, her voice raspy and desperate. "Get her out of my house. She is insane. She came here just to destroy us. Get her out of my pristine home before she ruins my entire reputation." I did not move toward the exit. I did not flinch at the threat of the police or the chief of police sitting just a few walls away. I simply reached into the sleek black leather portfolio I had been holding effortlessly at my side since I walked through the front doors. My movements were slow, highly deliberate, and completely unbothered by Preston's loud, frantic screaming. "You want to talk about this pristine home?" "Vivica," I asked, my voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the kitchen like a sharp knife through thin paper. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila legal folder. It was stuffed with heavily stamped official documents, notarized bank statements, and red-lined contracts. I stepped up to the massive marble kitchen island and dropped the heavy folder right in the center. It hit the solid stone surface with a loud, definitive smack that instantly silenced Preston. His thumb hovered over his phone screen, his eyes darting down to the legal documents. "Go ahead, Preston." I said, gesturing smoothly toward the folder. Call your friend the police chief, invite him into the kitchen. But before you ask him to arrest me for trespassing on my mother's property, you might want to open that folder and read the current property deed aloud for the room. Alicia stopped crying, wiping her ruined makeup and staring at the manila folder, as if it were a literal explosive device waiting to detonate. Preston slowly lowered his phone, his arrogant confidence entirely replaced by a deep, paranoid dread. He stepped forward and reached out for the folder, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped it open. Vivica let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the folder away from Preston, but she was not fast enough. Preston! No! Do not look at that! She shrieked, her voice filled with absolute terror. It is none of your business. It is private family matters. But Preston was already reading. His pale eyes scanned the top page, his brow furrowing in deep confusion that rapidly morphed into absolute shock. What is this? He muttered, flipping to the second page and then the third. Vivica, what did you do? I walked slowly around the kitchen island, letting the hard soles of my shoes click rhythmically against the floor. Let me explain it to him, Mother. I offered, my tone perfectly conversational and polite. You see, Preston? My mother has a very expensive addiction. She is hopelessly addicted to the illusion of extreme wealth. She needed to host massive catering events like the one happening in the next room. She needed to buy imported Persian rugs and wear custom designer gowns to prove to the women of Washington, D.C., that she was still royalty. Preston looked up from the papers, his mouth hanging slightly open. She took out a mortgage, he whispered, his voice hollow. She took out 3, I corrected him instantly, my voice ringing with cold, hard truth. She secretly mortgaged this massive estate 3 separate times over the last 5 years. She completely drained the equity that my late father worked his entire life to build. She signed highly predatory subprime loans with massive interest rates just to keep the lights on and the champagne flowing. Vivica covered her face with both hands, sobbing loudly into her palms. She could not even look at her precious golden child or her wealthy son-in-law. The ultimate queen of high society was standing in her expensive catering kitchen, completely exposed as a desperate broke fraud. You are bankrupt, Vivica Alicia whispered, staring at our mother in pure horror. The entire foundation of her privileged life was crashing down around her. You told me the estate was fully paid off. You told me my inheritance was completely secure in a trust fund. There is no trust fund, Alicia, I said, shutting down her last remaining delusion. There is absolutely nothing left. She spent your inheritance on floral arrangements, private country club memberships, and luxury cars she could not actually afford. She dug a massive financial grave just so she could comfortably look down on everyone else. Preston threw the heavy folder back onto the marble island in utter disgust. The papers scattered across the smooth stone, revealing the massive red numbers and the final foreclosure notices from the bank. You crazy old woman! Preston shouted at Vivica, completely abandoning any remaining shred of respect he had for her. You are millions of dollars in debt. You have been living off my money for the past 2 years, pretending you were an old money heiress, while you were secretly bleeding me dry. But Preston? I reminded him softly, you did not have any real money either, did you? You were both just entirely using each other. You used my mother's fake social standing to secure your lobbying clients, and she used your fake wealth to maintain her country club facade. You are a match made in heaven. 2 desperate, pathetic frauds trying to outplay each other while secretly drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. The police threat was completely forgotten. Preston stood there gripping the edge of the marble island, staring blankly at the foreclosure notices. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in, crushing the life out of their massive egos. They had spent the entire night mocking me for being poor and uneducated, and now they were looking at the very real legal documents that proved they were completely destitute. But the absolute best part of the manila folder was still waiting to be discovered. They had seen the mortgages, and they had seen the massive debt. But they had not yet flipped to the very last page. They had not yet seen the official transfer of ownership. They still thought the bank was coming to take the house. They did not know the absolute terrifying truth. Preston turned to the very last page of the thick stack of legal documents. His hands were shaking so violently that the heavy paper rattled against the solid marble countertop. He scanned the final paragraphs, his eyes darting back and forth across the dense legal jargon, until they finally locked onto the bold black ink at the bottom of the page. The official stamp of transfer. The name of the purchasing entity that had bought out the foreclosure from the major national bank. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes as if he were trying to clear a sudden blur from his vision. He read the name of the private equity firm aloud, his voice barely a raspy whisper. Nova Holdings Corporate Trust. He looked up at me, a deep crease forming between his brows. Who is Nova Holdings? He asked, his brain clearly struggling to process the rapidly unfolding nightmare. Why does it say the title was officially transferred to them yesterday morning? I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the pure, absolute silence of the kitchen wrap around us like a heavy velvet blanket. When a major bank is forced to foreclose on a highly toxic property, Preston? I explained, my voice, smooth and clinical, like a professor lecturing a failing student. They rarely want to deal with the messy, legal process of evicting the residents and selling the estate at a public auction. Instead, they bundle those bad debts and sell them off to private equity firms for pennies on the dollar. It is a very common practice in high finance. You should know this, considering you pretend to be a powerful corporate lobbyist. Preston swallowed hard, his chest heaving under his torn suit jacket. Yes, I know how bad debt works, he snapped weakly. But who is Nova Holdings? Why did they buy my mother-in-law's house? I smiled, a genuine, chilling smile that finally reached my eyes. Nova is the Latin word for New Preston, I said softly. And it just so happens to be the parent company that manages the massive global assets of Maison Noire. I am the sole primary shareholder and the executive chairwoman of the board. The words hung in the air, suspended in time. Vivica let out a low, agonizing moan that sounded like a wounded animal. Alicia collapsed backward against the caterer's prep table, sending a tall stack of silver serving trays crashing to the tile floor with a deafening metallic clatter. But nobody rushed in to check on the noise. The kitchen staff had already fled, and the wealthy guests in the living room were completely oblivious to the brutal destruction happening just a few walls away. Preston staggered backward as if I had just shot him squarely in the chest. He bumped into the expensive double-door refrigerator, sliding down slightly until he caught his balance. You... He breathed, his face completely devoid of color. You bought the debt. You bought the house. I did not just buy the debt, Preston. I corrected him, my tone dropping to a deadly serious register. I bought the absolute ownership of this entire property. Every single brick, every imported Persian rug, every blade of grass on the perfectly manicured lawn. It all legally belongs to me now. I am the sole owner of the Washington family estate, and that means I am your new landlord. Vivica pushed herself away from the granite island, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand upright. She stumbled toward me, reaching out with both hands, as if she were trying to grab onto a ghost. Nyla, she cried, hot tears streaming down her heavily made-up face, smearing her expensive foundation. Nyla, please, you cannot do this. This is my home. This is the house you grew up in. You cannot take it away from your own mother. I looked down at her grasping hands and took a single step backward, completely out of her reach. She stumbled and fell to her knees on the cold tile floor, sobbing hysterically into the fabric of her ruined backup dress. You did not act like a mother when you burned my clothes, Vivica, I said, looking down at her writhing, pathetic form. You did not act like a mother when you told your high society friends that I was a disgusting failure. You treated this house like an exclusive country club, and you actively banished me from it because I did not fit your incredibly fake aesthetic. Alicia was hyperventilating now, clutching her chest as she slid down the cabinets to sit on the floor next to the scattered silver trays. "Where are we going to go?" she sobbed, rocking back and forth in her cheap $15,000 knockoff gown. "We do not have any money. Preston spent everything. The bank accounts are frozen. Where are we supposed to live, Nyla?" I looked at my older sister, the golden child who had spent her entire existence mocking me and trying to keep me entirely beneath her. "That sounds like a serious personal problem, Alicia," I replied, entirely unmoved by her dramatic tears. "Perhaps Preston can use his elite political connections to find you a nice, comfortable cardboard box downtown. Or maybe you can go stay at that imaginary summer house in the Hamptons he supposedly just bought for you." Preston pushed himself off the refrigerator, his fists tightly clenched at his sides. His white savior complex was still desperately trying to fight its way out of the massive grave he had dug for himself. "You cannot just throw us out into the street tonight," he yelled, his voice cracking with pure terror. "It is highly illegal. We have tenant rights. You have to give us formal legal notice." "You are absolutely right, Preston," I agreed, nodding slowly. "The law requires me to give you a formal notice of eviction." I reached back into the black leather portfolio and pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy white paper. I placed it gently on the marble island, right next to the massive pile of foreclosure documents. "This is your official 30-day notice to vacate the premises. You have exactly 1 month to pack up your cheap knockoff clothes, your fake jewelry, and whatever dignity you have left, and get completely off my property." "30 days!" Vivica shrieked, her voice echoing off the ceiling. "You cannot do this to me, Nyla. My entire life is in this house. My friends are in the next room. If they find out I am broke and homeless, I will be completely ruined. I will be a laughingstock in this city." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow closure. "Your friends in the next room do not actually care about you, Vivica," I stated calmly, watching the brutal truth finally sink into her mind. "They only care about the expensive champagne you pour for them and the perfect image you project. The moment they find out you are bankrupt, they will drop you faster than you dropped me. You built a fragile paper castle entirely on lies and vanity. And now the wind is finally blowing." The reality of their situation settled heavily over the chaotic kitchen. There was no magical loophole to exploit. There was no wealthy investor coming to save them. Preston could not talk his way out of it, and Alicia could not buy her way out of it. They were completely and utterly trapped by their own toxic consequences. The massive house that had always been a terrifying prison for me was now officially mine, and I was using my key to lock them entirely out of my life. I let them sit there in their profound misery for a few more moments, listening to the pathetic sounds of their weeping. It was the sweetest symphony I had ever heard. They were finally experiencing the exact same deep, crushing humiliation they had forced me to endure for 20 years. They were completely stripped of their false superiority and left with nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth of their own failures. But the night was not quite over yet. The ultimate knockout blow. The massive public spectacle they feared more than anything else in the entire world was already walking up the front steps of my new house. Vivica slowly pushed herself up from the cold tile floor. Her heavy makeup was completely ruined, running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. The fierce, arrogant monster I had faced just 20 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate woman grasping at straws. She realized that her anger and her empty threats had absolutely no effect on me, so she instinctively shifted to the only other weapon she had left in her toxic emotional arsenal. She began to play the absolute victim. "Nyla, my sweet, beautiful girl," Vivica whispered, her voice trembling with forced emotion. She clasped her hands together against her chest, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I knew it. Deep down in my heart, I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. I stared at her, completely fascinated by the sheer psychological gymnastics she was attempting to perform right in front of my eyes. Just moments ago, she called me a pathetic fraud and a high school dropout who played with garbage. Now she was trying to claim total ownership of my massive global success. You see? Vivica continued, stepping a little closer, her voice taking on a sickly sweet tone of maternal pride that made my skin crawl. Everything I did to you was for a profound reason. When I burned your clothes that night, it broke my heart, Nyla. It really did. But I had to do it. I had to be the villain in your story, so you would finally wake up. I had to give you that tough love to push you out of your lazy comfort zone. Alicia looked up from the floor, staring at our mother as if she had suddenly grown a second head. Even the golden child could not comprehend the massive lie Vivica was desperately trying to spin. Alicia was watching her own mother instantly abandon her to attach herself to the new source of wealth. The sheer betrayal on my sister's face was almost tragic. If I had not been so terribly hard on you, Vivica pleaded, her hands reaching out toward me again, trying to grab my tailored sleeve. If I had not pushed you away from this house, you never would have gone to Paris. You never would have built Maison Noire. You never would have become a billionaire making custom gowns for the First Lady. I gave you the intense fire you needed, Nyla. My tough love made you the incredibly successful woman you are today. You owe your entire empire to me. The sheer audacity of her words hung heavily in the suffocating warm air of the catering kitchen. It was the classic gaslighting anthem of every emotionally abusive parent in history. She was completely erasing all the years of deep psychological torture, the cruel daily insults, the deliberate sabotage, and trying to rebrand it as a masterclass in highly effective parenting. She genuinely believed she could manipulate me into feeling grateful for the massive trauma she had intentionally inflicted upon my life. She wanted me to thank her for the nights I spent crying myself to sleep. She wanted me to thank her for the severe anxiety attacks and the crippling self-doubt she planted in my brain. "You think you built me, Vivica?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that forced her to stop moving. "You think your immense cruelty was some kind of brilliant, calculated strategy to ensure my ultimate success?" "Yes," she sobbed, nodding her head frantically as fake tears poured over her eyelashes. "A mother always knows exactly what is best for her own child. I made you strong, Nyla. I made you totally unstoppable." I let out a dry, hollow laugh that held absolutely no humor or warmth. The sound of it made Preston flinch against the refrigerator and caused Alicia to shrink further back against the wooden cabinets. "You did not make me strong, Vivica," I replied, looking directly into her frantic, desperate eyes. "I made myself strong in spite of you. I survived your incredibly toxic house. I survived your endless verbal abuse and your disgusting favoritism. I built my international empire using the heavy stones you constantly threw at my head, hoping I would drown." I stepped forward, forcing her to take a trembling step back. "Do not ever try to steal the credit for my survival," I warned her, my words cutting through her fake, pathetic tears like a perfectly sharpened blade. "You burned my clothes because you were deeply embarrassed by me. You kicked me out because I did not fit into your pathetic social climbing narrative. And you wanted to impress the shallow women drinking your expensive wine. You did not foresee my success. You genuinely wanted me to fail so you could point your manicured finger at me and feel much better about your own empty, meaningless existence." Vivica shook her head violently, refusing to accept the harsh, undeniable reality I was forcing down her throat. "No, Nyla, please," she begged, dropping her hands to her sides in total defeat as her entire narrative collapsed. "You have to understand my intentions. We are blood. We are a family. You cannot just abandon your own family when we need you the most. You have enough money to save all of us right now. You can easily pay off the bank debts. You can fix Preston's failing firm. You can buy Alicia a new wardrobe. We can be a real happy family again." "A real family?" I repeated the words, tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "You do not want a daughter, Vivica. You want a blank check? You want a silent, obedient sponsor to fund your expensive catering bills and your exclusive country club memberships. You want me to pay for the distinct privilege of being emotionally abused by you for the rest of my natural life. I looked at the three of them trapped together in the wreckage of their own making. The mother who traded her soul for temporary social status. The sister who married for shallow money and ended up with absolutely nothing. And the wealthy brother-in-law who gambled away his entire identity and his firm. They were a perfect, tragic portrait of toxic greed and profound, endless delusion. I do not owe you a single dime, I told her firmly, watching the last tiny spark of hope completely die in her terrified eyes. I do not owe you my forgiveness, and I certainly do not owe you my future. You made your permanent choices 8 years ago when you struck that match in the backyard and smiled while my dreams turned into dark smoke. Tonight is simply the universe finally handing you the ultimate bill. Alicia began to cry louder, realizing that her mother was perfectly willing to throw her under the bus to get to my money. The golden child was finally experiencing the exact same abandonment I had felt my entire life. Preston just stared blankly at the floor, completely broken by the realization that his massive white savior complex had been permanently destroyed by the very person he thought was beneath him. They had nothing left to say. Their weapons were entirely depleted. Their words meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. It was a profound feeling of complete emotional liberation. I was standing in the exact same room where they used to terrorize me, but I felt incredibly light. The heavy, invisible chains of childhood trauma simply dissolved into thin air. She tried to speak again, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no words came out. Her entire fake reality had completely crumbled, leaving her permanently trapped in a massive pit of her own making. The toxic gaslighting had completely failed. The fake motherly tears had bought her absolutely nothing. She finally realized that the obedient, desperate little girl she used to easily control was entirely dead, and the powerful, wealthy woman standing in front of her was completely immune to her toxic poison. I turned away from my weeping mother, breaking the intense eye contact, and looked toward the heavy, swinging doors that led back out to the main living room. The muffled sounds of polite, affluent chatter and clinking crystal glasses were still floating through the thick wooden panels. The elite guests of Washington, D.C. were completely oblivious to the massive financial and emotional slaughter that had just occurred right behind those doors. But their blissful ignorance was about to be violently shattered. The climax I had promised, the ultimate public reckoning I had meticulously planned, was finally arriving right on schedule just on the other side of those walls. I turned my back on the pathetic scene in the kitchen, fully intending to walk out and wait for my grand finale in the main hall. But Preston was not finished. His fragile ego had been completely pulverized, and his twisted white savior complex was bleeding out all over the tile floor. In his desperate, twisted mind, he still needed to prove that he was physically and socially superior to me. He could not accept that a black woman, the outcast of the family, had utterly destroyed him in a matter of minutes. I heard the heavy squeak of his expensive leather shoes lunging across the kitchen floor before I actually felt him. Preston closed the distance between us in 2 massive strides, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He reached out with his large, sweaty hands and violently grabbed my left shoulder, his thick fingers digging painfully into the fine wool of my custom jacket. "You are not going anywhere, you arrogant little ghetto trash," Preston hissed, his breath hot and reeking of stale whiskey. "You think you can just march in here and buy my life? You think a fancy French title makes you equal to us? You are nothing but a diversity quota. You are just a street rat who got lucky playing the system, and you do not belong in this neighborhood or in this society." He yanked my shoulder hard, trying to physically spin me around and throw me toward the back service exit. "I am going to throw you out into the alley where you belong," he roared, his voice completely losing any trace of his polished Washington diplomat persona. "You are a stain on this family, and I am not going to let some ungrateful hood rat take away everything I have built. I will drag you out by your hair if I have to." Vivica gasped loudly, covering her mouth, but she did not step forward to stop him. She stood frozen near the marble island, watching the physical escalation with terrified eyes, but refusing to intervene. Alicia remained perfectly still on the floor, watching her husband physically assault her sister with a blank, dead expression on her face. They were entirely willing to let him use physical violence if it meant putting me back in my place and somehow miraculously saving their fake crumbling empire. I did not scream, and I did not panic. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down into tears. I simply planted my heels firmly into the floor, anchoring myself, and locked my gaze onto his pale, bloodshot eyes. The sheer, pathetic nature of his attack was almost comical to me now. This was the true face of his so-called old money pedigree. When his bank accounts dried up, and his fake intellect failed him, he immediately reverted to the lowest, most primitive form of aggression, throwing around racial classist microaggressions, and using his physical size to intimidate a woman. "Take your hand off me, Preston," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave, incredibly calm, but laced with pure lethal intent. "I am going to give you exactly 3 seconds to remove your sweaty fingers from my jacket before I ruin whatever is left of your pathetic existence." He laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed off the stainless steel appliances and the high ceiling. "You do not give the orders here," he spat, tightening his grip on my shoulder until it actually started to ache. "I do not care who you think you are out in Europe. In this city, I am the one with all the power. I will have you completely destroyed. I will call my elite political contacts and have your little fashion brand investigated for fraud. You are absolutely nothing compared to me and my family legacy." One, I counted softly, completely ignoring his manic, desperate threats. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Nyla?" He continued, practically spitting in my face as his grip grew tighter and his face turned a deeper shade of red. "You think you won because you bought some bad debt from a bank? I will tie you up in civil court for the next 10 years. I will personally bleed you dry with endless legal fees until you are back to digging through charity bins in the slums." "2," I whispered, my eyes narrowing as I prepared to physically defend myself, shifting my weight slightly to break his aggressive hold. But I never got the chance to say 3. Before Preston could yank me toward the back door, the thick, suffocating tension in the catering kitchen was violently shattered by a sound that made all 3 of them instantly freeze in their tracks. It was the heavy, resonant chiming of the grand front doorbell. It echoed loudly through the entire massive estate, cutting through the soft jazz music playing in the living room and piercing straight through the thick wooden doors of the kitchen. Preston instinctively loosened his grip on my shoulder, his head snapping toward the hallway like a frightened animal. Vivica scrambled up from the floor, her eyes wide with sudden renewed panic. The front doorbell was never supposed to ring during a private high society catered event. All the wealthy guests, the senators and local politicians, had already arrived hours ago. The heavy front gates were supposed to be firmly locked for the remainder of the evening to ensure complete privacy for the elite attendees. The doorbell chimed a second time, longer and much more insistent than the first. It was not the polite, hesitant ring of a lost delivery driver or a late party guest trying to sneak in unnoticed. It was the firm, demanding ring of someone who expected the heavy doors to be opened immediately. "Who is that?" Alicia whispered, her voice trembling, as she slowly pulled herself up from the cold tile floor, using the edge of the prep table for support. "Preston, did you invite someone else to the party?" "I did not invite anyone," Preston stammered, his face growing even paler, if that was somehow humanly possible. He completely let go of my shoulder, taking a clumsy step backward. His brief moment of violent, toxic bravado instantly evaporated into thin air, leaving him looking like a terrified little boy caught in a lie. He smoothed down his torn suit lapel, trying desperately to pull his shattered professional mask back into place before anyone else saw him. The loud chiming echoed a third time, followed by 3 heavy, authoritative knocks that physically shook the solid mahogany doors. The sound carried a distinct weight of absolute power that made the hair on the back of Preston's neck stand straight up. The entire kitchen fell deathly silent. Even the muffled sounds of the guests in the main living room suddenly stopped completely. The politicians and wealthy socialites had paused their networking conversations, entirely distracted by the incredibly aggressive knocking at the main entrance. I calmly lifted my hand and brushed my shoulder right where Preston's sweaty fingers had just wrinkled my immaculate jacket. I smoothed the fine obsidian wool, taking my time before looking at him with a cold, triumphant smile. "You were just talking about power, Preston," I said softly, stepping past his frozen, trembling form. "You were just bragging to me about your elite political contacts and how you run this entire city. Well, you should probably go answer the front door right now. I believe your final reality check has just arrived." I walked confidently toward the swinging kitchen doors, pushing them open and stepping back out into the bright light of the grand hallway. Behind me, Preston, Vivica, and Alicia hesitated for a tiny fraction of a second before scrambling to follow me, utterly terrified of what was waiting on the other side of that door. The grand finale of my sweet revenge was officially starting, and I was going to make sure they all had a front row seat to witness their own absolute destruction. I pushed through the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen and stepped back out into the bright light of the grand hallway. The contrast was incredibly jarring. Behind me, the kitchen was a total disaster zone filled with broken silver trays and the heavy stench of massive financial ruin. But out here in the grand foyer, the soft jazz music was still playing, and the crystal chandeliers were still casting a warm golden glow over the expensive imported rugs. The wealthy guests of Washington, D.C. were completely oblivious to the fact that the actual owner of the house they were standing in was no longer Vivica Washington, but the very daughter she had just spent the entire night viciously mocking. I walked slowly toward the massive front entrance, my heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. Preston, Vivica, and Alicia stumbled out of the kitchen right behind me. They looked like absolute wrecks. Preston's designer suit was torn, his face was bleeding from his wife's frantic scratches, and he was sweating profusely. Alicia was dragging the heavy emerald fabric of her cheap fake gown, her face streaked with ruined mascara. Vivica looked like a hollow ghost, desperately clinging to the walls for physical support. They were a pathetic parade of toxic vanity, completely stripped of their fake armor. The loud, demanding knocks echoed against the thick mahogany wood for a fourth time. In the main living room, the local politicians and affluent socialites had entirely stopped their networking conversations. The senator wives set down their champagne glasses, turning their heads to stare curiously at the entryway. Maria, the elderly housekeeper, who had worked for my family for nearly a decade, was standing near the door, her hands trembling nervously. She looked at my mother for permission to open it, but Vivica was too paralyzed by shock to even give a simple nod. "Open the door, Maria," I instructed, my voice calm and perfectly clear, carrying across the quiet foyer. "It is completely fine." Maria hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting toward my mother. But when Vivica said absolutely nothing, the housekeeper slowly turned the heavy brass handle and pulled the double doors inward. A rush of crisp, cold night air swept into the warm, heavily perfumed hallway. Preston suddenly stood up a little straighter, aggressively wiping the sweat from his forehead. His massive ego was desperately trying to resuscitate itself. He genuinely believed his empty threat had somehow magically materialized. He thought the local police chief had arrived to personally arrest me and restore his fragile sense of absolute authority. He took a deep breath, attempting to puff out his chest and project the image of a powerful Washington lobbyist taking total control of a difficult domestic situation. But the people standing on the front porch were not local police officers. Two massive men stepped over the threshold, moving with a highly synchronized and lethal precision that instantly commanded the entire room. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits, their posture rigid, their eyes constantly scanning the immediate area for any potential threats. They both wore coiled acoustic earpieces, discreetly tucked behind their ears, and tiny lapel pins that caught the bright light of the chandelier. Anyone who lived and worked in Washington, D.C. instantly recognized that specific uniform. They were agents of the United States Secret Service. The sheer collective gasp that rippled through the living room was almost deafening. Local senators and wealthy corporate donors instinctively took a step back, their political instincts immediately kicking in. The presence of the Secret Service at a private residential watch party meant only one thing. Someone of immense federal importance was standing right outside. A third man stepped into the grand foyer, flanked closely by the two massive agents. He was an older, distinguished gentleman with silver hair, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and an expression of absolute, unquestionable authority. I knew exactly who he was because we had spoken on the phone several times over the past few weeks, coordinating the final intricate details of the inaugural gown. But the wealthy guests in the living room knew him for an entirely different reason. It was the White House Chief of Staff. The silence in the massive house became so profound you could actually hear the soft rustling of the silk dresses as the socialites nervously shifted their weight. The local politicians who had spent the entire night bragging about their minor regional influence were completely dwarfed by the arrival of one of the most powerful men in the entire federal government. The Chief of Staff did not attend random suburban watch parties. His presence was a massive tectonic shift in the social hierarchy of the room. Preston completely misread the entire situation. His arrogant brain, heavily clouded by panic, and his desperate need to maintain his facade, simply could not process why the Chief of Staff would be standing in his mother-in-law's foyer. So his default toxic instinct took over entirely. He saw a powerful man and immediately tried to leverage the moment to his own advantage. He shoved past Alicia, completely ignoring her quiet sob of protest, and practically sprinted toward the front door. He plastered a fake, confident smile across his bleeding face, attempting to hide his torn suit jacket by keeping his arm tightly pressed against his side. Mr. Chief of Staff Preston said, his voice loud and incredibly desperate, projecting false familiarity as he reached out his right hand for a firm handshake. "What an absolute honor to have you here tonight. I am Preston Harrington, managing partner at Harrington & Associates lobbying firm. We have actually been trying to get a meeting on your official schedule for the past 3 months regarding the new defense spending bill. Please come in and let me get you a drink. We were just dealing with a minor security issue, but my staff has it completely under control." He actually referred to me as a minor security issue. Even in the face of his own absolute destruction, he still tried to play the role of the benevolent, wealthy homeowner, protecting his elite guests from the crazy trespasser. He stood there with his hand extended, waiting for the powerful man to validate his existence and completely ignore my presence. The Chief of Staff stopped walking. He did not smile. He did not reach out to shake Preston's desperately extended hand. He simply looked at the bleeding, sweating lobbyist with an expression of mild disgust, as if Preston were a highly unpleasant insect that had just crawled across his expensive shoes. The two Secret Service agents simultaneously shifted their weight, placing themselves slightly between Preston and the Chief of Staff, their hands resting casually but dangerously near their waistbands. Preston slowly lowered his hand, his fake confident smile faltering as the incredibly awkward and humiliating rejection played out in front of every single important person in the room. The local politicians who had been hanging on to Preston's every word earlier in the evening were now actively looking away, pretending they did not even know him. The social death of Preston Harrington was happening in real time. The Chief of Staff looked past Preston, completely dismissing him from his reality. His sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the grand foyer and the shattered remains of my toxic family until they finally landed directly on me. His stern expression instantly softened into a look of profound, genuine respect. He completely stepped around Preston, leaving the arrogant lobbyist standing frozen in the middle of the marble floor. The Chief of Staff walked straight toward me, his polished shoes echoing softly in the dead, silent room. The guests parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear path for him. Vivica pressed her back against the wall, her eyes bulging out of her head in pure, unadulterated shock. Alicia covered her mouth to muffle a tiny squeak of terror. They watched in absolute horror as the most powerful political operative in Washington, D.C., stopped right in front of the daughter they had violently thrown away and respectfully bowed his head. The chief of staff stood perfectly straight after his respectful bow, completely ignoring the absolute chaos and the terrified wealthy guests surrounding us. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice projecting a calm, absolute authority that echoed off the high marble ceilings. "The presidential motorcade is waiting for you outside. The First Lady specifically requested your presence for the opening dance. She refuses to take the floor until the brilliant woman who created her gown is standing right beside her." The collective gasp that swept through the living room was so loud it sounded like all the oxygen was being simultaneously sucked out of the massive space. The senators' wives, the corporate donors, the elite local politicians, they all stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The narrative my mother had carefully spun for the last 8 years was instantly obliterated by a single sentence from the White House Chief of Staff. I was not a failure. I was not a charity case. I was a globally recognized visionary who commanded the respect of the highest office in the nation. I watched my mother out of the corner of my eye. Vivica Washington, the woman who had worshipped political power and social status. Her entire miserable life finally reached her absolute breaking point. Her trembling legs completely gave out beneath her. She dropped to her knees, hitting the hard marble floor with a dull, sickening thud. She did not try to catch herself. She just knelt there, the ruined fabric of her backup dress pooling around her, staring up at me as if I were a terrifying divine entity she had accidentally cursed. Her hands lay limp at her sides, her face completely blank as the sheer magnitude of her colossal mistake finally broke her mind. She had thrown away the one daughter who could have given her everything she ever dreamed of. Alicia was leaning heavily against the grand staircase, her face buried in her hands, weeping silently. The golden child was completely overshadowed, permanently eclipsed by the sister she had spent her entire life trying to destroy. The massive $15,000 fake emerald dress suddenly looked exactly like what it was, a cheap, pathetic costume worn by a woman playing pretend. The wealthy friends she had invited to show off her perfect marriage were now actively whispering and pointing at her ruin. "Thank you, Mr. Chief of Staff," I replied, my voice perfectly level, betraying none of the immense satisfaction surging through my veins. "Please inform the First Lady that I am honored, and I will be right out." He nodded once, his expression filled with genuine admiration. "We will clear a path for you, Mrs. Washington," he said, gesturing to the 2 massive Secret Service agents who immediately stepped forward to secure the immediate perimeter. But before I could take a single step toward the heavy mahogany doors, Preston suddenly lunged forward, breaking the invisible barrier of respect the room had just established. He was completely unhinged, driven by pure blind desperation. His entire firm was bankrupt, his marriage was destroyed, and his massive ego was bleeding out on the floor. He saw the Chief of Staff as his absolute last lifeline. "Sir!" "Please," Preston begged, stepping right into the path of the Chief of Staff, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of submission. "Mr. Chief of Staff, you have to listen to me. I am Preston Harrington. My firm handles major defense contracts. We have been unfairly targeted by the administration. Our cybersecurity initiatives were completely stripped without cause. If I could just get 5 minutes of your time in your office next week, I can prove the massive value we bring to the federal government. Please, I am begging you." The Chief of Staff stopped and looked at Preston with an expression of pure icy disdain. He did not say a single word. He did not even acknowledge the frantic, desperate lobbyist as a human being. He simply looked at the 2 Secret Service agents who immediately placed their massive hands firmly on Preston's chest, physically shoving him backward with effortless force. Preston stumbled, completely losing his balance and crashing into a small decorative table, sending a crystal vase shattering onto the marble floor. He stayed there, panting heavily, his eyes darting frantically between me and the powerful man standing next to me. His torn suit jacket and bleeding face made him look like a common street brawler entirely out of place in a room full of high society elites. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Preston, looking down at his pathetic, crumpled form. You really do not understand how any of this works? Do you, Preston? I asked, my voice cold and incredibly sharp. You think the federal government just randomly decided to pull your massive defense contracts? You think it was just a string of bad luck or a routine administrative audit? Preston froze, his eyes widening as a new, fresh wave of absolute terror washed over him. What are you saying? He whispered, his voice cracking horribly. I am saying that the current administration heavily relies on the strategic financial guidance of major global equity firms, I explained, watching the brutal truth slowly tear his mind apart. Firms like Nova Holdings. When the White House asked for a comprehensive review of highly vulnerable government contractors, my private equity firm provided the heavily detailed intelligence report. We specifically highlighted the massive internal corruption, the gross financial mismanagement, and the severe security risks actively operating inside Harrington and Associates. The entire room was dead silent, hanging on to my every word. The local politicians who used to do business with Preston were now physically backing away from him, terrified that his toxic radiation would somehow infect their own careers. The senator who had been drinking Preston's champagne earlier turned his back entirely, refusing to even make eye contact with the disgraced lobbyist. I did not just buy my mother's debt, Preston. I continued, my voice echoing flawlessly in the grand foyer. I am the exact reason you lost the aerospace contract. I am the exact reason the Department of Defense completely pulled your cybersecurity initiative. I personally advised the administration to sever all federal ties with your firm, because a man who steals from his own wife to pay off black market gambling debts cannot be trusted with national security. Preston let out a sound that was barely human. It was a high-pitched, wheezing gasp of pure, unadulterated devastation. The massive illusion of his white savior complex, his old money arrogance, his absolute certainty that he was untouchable, it all instantly vaporized. He realized that while he was busy mocking my clothes and offering me a job as a janitor, I had systematically and ruthlessly dismantled his entire life from the highest levels of global power. I had not just beaten him in an argument, I had completely erased his existence from the very city he thought he owned. He did not scream. He did not try to argue. The absolute crushing weight of his reality completely broke him physically and mentally. His knees buckled and he collapsed entirely onto the marble floor right next to the shattered pieces of the crystal vase. He curled into a tight, pathetic ball, wrapping his arms around his head as heavy, uncontrollable sobs racked his entire body. The powerful, untouchable Washington lobbyist was reduced to a weeping, shattered mess on the floor of the house he no longer owned. Alicia did not even look at him. She just continued to cry into her hands, mourning the loss of her superficial life. Vivica remained completely frozen on her knees, staring blankly at the wall, unable to process the total destruction of her social empire. The perfect, wealthy family was nothing more than a pile of burning ash, and I was the one holding the match. They had spent their entire lives trying to make me feel small and insignificant, but in the end, their own greed and vanity had done all the heavy lifting. They had dug their own graves, and I simply refused to pull them out. The chief of staff gently gestured toward the open front doors, where the imposing black SUV of the presidential motorcade was idling on the circular driveway. I nodded and took a single step forward, but before I could completely cross the marble floor, I felt a weak, desperate hand grasp the fabric of my sleeve. It was my mother. Vivica had somehow managed to crawl up from the floor, her face a ruined mask of smeared makeup and absolute panic. Nyla, please, she begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine that echoed in the silent foyer. My beautiful daughter, my brilliant girl, please do not leave me here like this. Take me with you to the inaugural ball. I am your mother. I should be standing right next to you on that red carpet. We can show the whole world what a perfect family we are. I can help you navigate the press, Nyla. I know all the right people. Please, just let me come with you. I looked down at her grasping hand and felt absolutely nothing. The desperate woman begging for a photo op was a complete stranger to me now. I did not pull my arm away immediately. I just looked into her empty, terrified eyes and let the silence stretch out until she was forced to drop her hand in pure shame. I turned to the two massive Secret Service agents standing near the doorway. "Gentlemen," I said softly, "there is exactly one item of actual value in this entire estate. It is sitting in the far corner of the damp basement. It is a rusted vintage Singer sewing machine that belonged to my late grandmother. Please retrieve it and place it in the trunk of my vehicle." One of the agents immediately nodded and briskly walked down the hall toward the basement stairs, completely ignoring the horrified stares of the local politicians. Vivica looked at me in total confusion, her mind unable to comprehend why a billionaire fashion designer would want a worthless piece of rusted metal. "A sewing machine," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Nyla, why do you want that old piece of junk? You own a global fashion house. You own this entire estate." I looked around the grand foyer, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the imported rugs, and the terrified affluent guests who were actively pretending they were not witnessing the complete collapse of the Washington family. "You can keep the empty house," Vivica, I told her, my voice echoing with finality. "You can sit in it for your last 30 days and stare at the expensive walls. You can keep the fake designer dresses and the meaningless social titles. I am taking the only thing in this entire building that actually has a soul." My grandmother was the only person who ever believed in my talent. She taught me how to thread a needle when my own mother told me I was a worthless burden. That rusted machine built my empire. This house just built a prison. The Secret Service agent returned a few moments later, effortlessly carrying the heavy cast-iron sewing machine as if it weighed absolutely nothing. He carried it out the front doors past the stunned faces of the wealthy socialites. I turned away from Vivica and began to walk toward the exit. My head held high, my steps perfectly measured. Behind me, the absolute silence of the grand foyer finally broke. It did not break with polite conversation, but with the vicious, ugly sounds of a toxic family turning on itself. Alicia suddenly shrieked at Preston, her voice filled with pure venom, blaming him for ruining her life and leaving her homeless. Preston screamed right back at her, his voice completely unhinged, blaming her massive vanity for his financial ruin. Vivica began to wail loudly, entirely consumed by her own tragic downfall. They were trapped in a hell of their own making, tearing each other apart like starving animals fighting over scraps. I did not look back. I crossed the threshold of the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air of Washington, D.C. The moment my shoes touched the front porch, a massive, blinding wave of camera flashes lit up the dark night. The press corps had somehow discovered the location of the watch party, and they were crowded around the bottom of the driveway, their cameras clicking furiously to capture the newly revealed designer of the First Lady. The Secret Service agents quickly flanked me, creating a secure barrier between me and the flashing lights. The Chief of Staff walked beside me, leading me directly to the waiting armored SUV. The heavy door was pulled open, and I slid into the luxurious leather seat. The vintage Singer sewing machine was safely secured in the back. As the massive vehicle slowly pulled away from the curb, the flashing lights of the cameras faded into the distance. The sounds of my family screaming and weeping were entirely gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the powerful engine and the soft rhythm of my own steady breathing. I looked out the tinted window, watching the dark silhouette of the city skyline roll by. For so many years, I had allowed those people to weave my narrative. I had let them stitch my self-worth using threads of guilt, shame, and cruel manipulation. I had believed that because we shared the same blood, I was permanently obligated to endure their poison. But the greatest freedom in life comes from realizing that you hold the scissors. You have the absolute power to cut the toxic ties that bind you to people who only want to drag you down. You do not have to accept the ugly, ill-fitting garment your family tries to force you into. You can simply walk away entirely unapologetic and weave your own destiny. My mother burned my clothes because she wanted to destroy my future. But all she did was teach me how to rise from the ashes. The wounds they inflicted had finally turned into scars, and those scars were the foundation of an empire they could never touch. I was no longer the ungrateful daughter or the tragic black sheep. I was exactly who I chose to be. And tonight, as I rode toward the White House, I knew my true life was just beginning. The greatest lesson I learned from walking away is that family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones holding the match to burn your dreams. But you do not have to accept the toxic narrative they write for you. True power comes from recognizing your own worth and refusing to let arrogant people dictate your future. You cannot build a healthy life while staying anchored to a poisoned foundation. The most profound act of self-love is closing the door on those who never saw your value and finally choosing yourself. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to share your own journey of cutting toxic ties in the comments below.